African history didn't start in 1500 when Europeans began expanding into this continent. For thousands of years before that, Africa was trading with Arabs and with each other. And West Africa and Southern Africa had powerful empires.
In the 16th century, when European countries started setting up colonies all over the world, they found Africa a tough nut to crack.
First of all, there wasn't a whole lot of room for the Europeans to get into the African trade business. Arabs had pretty much sewn that up. Secondly, the climate, except for the far south, wasn't that great for settlement.
Europe just saw Africa as a big chunk of land that you had to get around in order to get to India and China. The European countries did, however, compete to keep each other out of Africa. They set up armed trading posts on the coasts, mostly on the west coast, the closest point to the Americas, and therefore the best location for exporting slaves. They basically left the interior to intra-African and African-Arab trade.
There were exceptions, though. In the 17th century, Dutch Protestants, known as Afrikaners, started a colony down around the Cape at the southern tip of Africa to escape religious persecution.
Then suddenly, everything changed.
Starting around 1870, the European countries were involved in a high-stakes chess match, and Africa was the board. France and Germany seized new colonies to catch up with Britain, who had colonies everywhere else in the world. Spain, Portugal, and Italy got into the mix too. Then, when Britain saw this, it felt compelled to jump in too.
After a while, the map of Africa was a mess. To rectify this, the European countries convened the Berlin Conference in 1884 to work out the boundaries of Africa that they would recognize. The problem? Nobody bothered to consult any Africans.
In fact, many of the people at the conference in Berlin had never been to Africa and had no idea what they were giving up and taking. But most of these boundaries stuck, even though some lines grouped traditional enemies together and other lines divided major ethnic groups.
Date line yesteryear. Who got what in Berlin is a bit complicated. But in general, Britain got most of southern and east Africa, while France, in addition to their holdings in North Africa, got most of West Africa. Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, and Italy picked up scattered pieces. It should be noted, however, that Liberia, here on the Atlantic coast, had been an independent state since 1847.
So, what did the Europeans do with their colonies in Africa? They looked to turn a profit. First, they taxed the land, which forced the indigenous peoples to work in European-controlled mines or plantations to pay the taxes.
A favorite tactic used by the colonists to diffuse resistance was to promote a minority ethnic group over the majority. That way, the majority tribe would blame the ruling minority tribe and not the European colonial powers, who ran things from behind the scenes.
3 exceptions to this were in Kenya, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, which were settler colonies. Here, a small group of Europeans ruled the area, much like mini-empires.
Okay, that's the basic colonial period from about 1870 to about 1960. Things during this time were basically business as usual, with the exception that the Germans were forced to give up their colonies after World War I. These colonies were then picked up by the other colonial powers.
During this time, the Europeans realized that Africa was a treasure chest of mineral resources. Coal, gold, and diamonds in South Africa, diamonds in Namibia and Botswana, coal and bauxite in Zimbabwe, copper in Central Africa, and even oil in Gabon and Nigeria. The continent was loaded.
Well, long story short, after World War II, global politics had changed. And starting with Ghana in 1957, most of sub-Saharan Africa became independent by the early 1960s. There were exceptions, but hey, there's always exceptions, like the Portuguese colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, and Guinea-Bissau, which didn't gain independence until 1974, and South Africa, where the Afrikaner-led government, although independent from any European country, refused to share power with the African majority until 1996.
Okay, that puts us up to speed with the development of sub-Saharan Africa. But what about some of the issues confronting the region today?
In many ways, sub-Saharan Africa is still struggling with the legacy of colonialism, when a lot of the natural and human resources were exploited rather than developed. 2 of the main problems we'll touch on are 1, multi-ethnic tensions, and 2, acquired immune deficiency syndrome.
Remember that conference in Berlin? The Europeans just drew lines across the map without African input. Boundary lines were drawn that went right through the middle of existing African nations, and, in other cases, groups that had a long history of problems with each other were pushed together into one colony. With independence, this one colony became one country, but within that country you've got many ethnicities.
Ethnicities may not have gotten along with each other historically, or the colonial powers had favored one party over the others. This has an effect on the economy, as outside investors are wary of investing money where they aren't sure who really controls the country.
More recently, a new scourge has ravaged sub-Saharan Africa, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. The disease has spread throughout this region quicker than any other area, and the facts are harrowing.
Over 2/3 of the world's people with HIV, that's the virus that causes AIDS, live in sub-Saharan Africa. Through the end of the 1990s, almost 14 million people in Africa had died of AIDS-related deaths. That's 85% of the world's AIDS-related deaths.
Those are some of the issues sub-Saharan Africa is wrestling with. Well, the show's almost over, but before we go, let's have a quick review.